Fuel prices are no longer rising at the same speed they were earlier in 2026. The headlines have become less intense. The sharp weekly jumps that drew attention across the country have slowed, but for many households, the pressure never really disappeared. It simply became part of everyday life. Gasoline prices reached around $4.18 per gallon during April 2026. Diesel climbed near $5.65 per gallon after rising roughly 50% from earlier levels near the mid-$3 range. Those increases moved quickly through the economy. Transportation costs increased. Deliveries became more expensive. Goods carried higher freight costs before they ever reached store shelves. Even after the pace of those increases slowed, the effect remained. For many people, the most important change is no longer the price itself. It is the behavior that follows it. The adjustment often happens quietly. There is no single moment where routines suddenly stop. No dramatic shift that immediately changes daily life. Instead, the changes appear gradually. Small decisions begin to accumulate over time. A trip gets postponed until several errands can be combined together. Driving becomes more intentional. Optional travel becomes easier to skip. A route that once felt routine starts becoming something to think about first. These are not dramatic reactions. They are measured adjustments to costs that remain elevated longer than expected. The difference matters because this stage of economic pressure looks different from the initial shock. Earlier in the year, the focus was on rapid price movement. Fuel prices increased quickly as refinery disruptions removed more than 800,000 barrels per day from supply, and gasoline inventories declined by approximately 6.08 million barrels in a single week. Refinery utilization remained near 90 to 95%, limiting the system's ability to respond quickly. The result was visible and immediate. Prices rose rapidly across the country. Now the situation feels different. Prices are no longer accelerating in the same way, but they also have not returned to previous levels. Gasoline remains elevated. Diesel remains elevated. Transportation costs remain elevated. The pressure continues even without a new spike. That persistence changes how households respond. At first, rising costs feel temporary. People expect prices to normalize after the disruption passes. But when elevated costs continue for months, the response begins to shift from reaction to adaptation. Budgets adjust, habits adjust. Daily movement becomes more calculated. Not because people suddenly stop driving, but because sustained pressure changes how routine decisions are made. This shift can be difficult to measure directly because it develops slowly. The economy does not always reveal itself through dramatic moments. Sometimes the clearest signals appear in small behavioral changes repeated across millions of households at the same time. Fuel costs affect more than transportation. Diesel continues to move approximately 75% of goods across the United States. When diesel remains above $5 per gallon, transportation costs continue influencing groceries, retail products, deliveries, and household expenses. Earlier increases remain embedded throughout supply chains because goods already transported under higher cost conditions continue moving through the system. The result is a cost structure that remains elevated even after the initial surge slows. For consumers, this creates a particular kind of pressure. Spending no longer feels unstable in the same way it did during the initial spike. Instead, it feels consistently expensive. That consistency changes expectations. People begin adapting not to a temporary disruption, but to the possibility that higher costs may remain part of normal life for longer than anticipated. Data from this period reflects that pressure. Approximately 55% of Americans reported fuel costs affecting their finances, while roughly 21% described the impact as severe. Those figures represent more than frustration at the pump. They reflect the broader effect of elevated transportation and living costs spreading across daily spending. What makes this stage important is that it often develops quietly. The earlier phase produced headlines because prices were moving rapidly. The current phase produces fewer dramatic changes, but the underlying pressure continues shaping behavior. That is where the deeper economic story begins to appear. The most significant shifts in an economy are not always sudden. Sometimes they emerge gradually through routine decisions repeated over time. Fewer unnecessary trips, more careful budgeting, reduced flexibility in everyday spending. Small adjustments that seem insignificant individually but become meaningful when they appear across millions of households simultaneously. This is not a story about panic or collapse. It is a story about normalization. Elevated costs remain in place long enough that people begin adapting around them. The adjustment becomes part of ordinary life, and that quiet adaptation may reveal more about the current economy than the original price spike itself. The pressure that households are experiencing now did not begin all at once. It developed through a sequence of events that moved rapidly across the fuel system during the early months of 2026. At first, the changes appeared concentrated within energy markets and refinery operations. But as conditions tightened, the effects spread outward into transportation costs, consumer prices, and eventually daily routines. The first stage was the rapid increase in fuel prices. During early 2026, gasoline prices across the United States rose by roughly $1.19 per gallon, representing an increase of about 40% over a relatively short period. Diesel moved even more sharply. Prices climbed from levels near $3.61 per gallon to more than $5.38, eventually approaching approximately $5.65 per gallon by April. The speed of these increases was important because it left little time for households or businesses to adjust gradually. The rise was not isolated to one region or one temporary disruption. It reflected tightening conditions across the broader fuel system. One of the most significant pressures came from refinery disruptions that removed more than 800,000 barrels per day from supply. At the same time, gasoline inventories declined by approximately 6.08 million barrels within a single week. Inventory levels fell to around 3% below the 5-year average, reducing the system's flexibility even further. These developments occurred while refinery utilization was already operating near 90 to 95% capacity. That detail became especially important because it meant there was limited room to quickly increase production and offset supply losses. The system was already operating near its practical limits before disruptions intensified. When supply tightens under those conditions, prices tend to move quickly. Lower inventories reduce the buffer available to absorb disruptions. Refinery outages reduce available output. Wholesale fuel costs rise in response, and retail prices begin following shortly afterward. What consumers saw at gas stations during that period was the visible result of those pressures moving through the system. At first, the impact felt concentrated at the pump. Drivers noticed higher weekly costs almost immediately. But the pressure did not stop there because fuel is not only a consumer expense, it is also a foundational operating cost across transportation and logistics. That distinction became especially important with diesel. Unlike gasoline, which is tied mainly to personal driving, diesel supports the movement of goods across the economy. Approximately 75% of goods in the United States are transported by truck, and those trucks rely heavily on diesel fuel. When diesel prices increased toward $5.65 per gallon, the effect extended far beyond freight companies themselves. Transportation costs began rising across the system. Reports during this period indicated that approximately 91% of carriers were affected by elevated fuel expenses. For trucking companies, fuel is one of the largest operating costs. A rapid increase of nearly 50% in diesel prices significantly changed the cost of moving goods across long distances. Some carriers reduced activity or adjusted routes in response to those higher expenses. As transportation costs increased, freight rates also began adjusting upward. Businesses receiving goods then faced higher delivery costs, and those costs started moving through supply chains into retail pricing. Groceries, household goods, deliveries, and other everyday purchases gradually began reflecting the higher cost of transportation. This is where the pressure started changing character. At the beginning, consumers experienced fuel prices directly through personal driving expenses. But as higher transportation costs spread outward, the impact became broader and more persistent. Costs were no longer isolated to gasoline purchases. They became embedded across multiple categories of household spending. At the same time, the system itself remained constrained. Refinery utilization stayed elevated, inventories remained below normal levels, and diesel prices continued operating at historically high ranges. Even after the most rapid phase of the increase slowed, the cost structure created during that period remained in place. That distinction shaped the next stage of the economy. The initial fuel spike created immediate financial pressure, but the more lasting effect came from how those costs spread through transportation and supply chains over time. Once businesses adjusted pricing to reflect higher freight and operational expenses, the system no longer depended on another sharp increase to remain expensive. The earlier rise had already been absorbed into the structure of costs. For households, this meant the pressure began shifting from temporary shock to ongoing adjustment. At first, the reaction was immediate concern over rising prices, but as elevated costs continued month after month, the experience became more complicated. The issue was no longer only about sudden increases. It became about living within a system where prices had stabilized at a higher level than before. That transition matters because it changes how people respond. Temporary increases often produce temporary reactions. Sustained increases produce adaptation. When costs remain elevated long enough, households begin adjusting routines, spending patterns and expectations around those costs. The pressure becomes less dramatic but more deeply integrated into daily life. This is where the broader economic story begins. The earlier phase was defined by visible price movement driven by supply disruption and declining inventories. The next phase would be defined less by headlines and more by behavior. The shift from temporary pressure to something that feels permanent did not happen because prices continued rising rapidly. In many cases, the pace of increase had already slowed. What changed was that elevated costs remained in place long enough for households and businesses to begin adjusting around them. That is the point where expensive starts feeling normal. During the earlier phase of 2026, the focus was on movement. Gasoline prices increased quickly. Diesel climbed sharply. Supply disruptions and falling inventories created visible instability. And the speed of those increases made the pressure feel immediate. Consumers reacted to the shock itself because prices were changing fast enough to notice week by week. But over time, the economy moved into a different stage. The increases slowed, headlines became less urgent, yet fuel remained expensive relative to earlier levels. Gasoline around $4.18 per gallon and diesel near $5.65 represented more than temporary spikes. They became part of the system's operating baseline. That distinction matters because people respond differently to a high price than they do to a rapidly changing price. When prices rise suddenly, consumers tend to view the increase as temporary. There is an expectation that conditions will normalize after the disruption passes, but when elevated prices remain for months, expectations begin changing. What originally felt unusual gradually becomes something households start planning around. This process is not psychological alone. It is reinforced by how costs remain embedded throughout the economy after the initial increase. Diesel is one of the clearest examples. Earlier increases in diesel prices moved directly into transportation costs. Since approximately 75% of goods are moved by truck, higher diesel prices affected freight expenses across supply chains. Once those transportation costs increased, businesses adjusted pricing to reflect the new expense structure. That adjustment did not disappear simply because fuel stopped accelerating upward. Goods already transported under higher cost conditions remained inside warehouses, distribution centers, and retail inventory systems. Those products continued reaching consumers with pricing that reflected earlier transportation costs. Even if fuel prices stabilized, the goods already moving through the system continued carrying the cost structure created during the earlier spike. This created a lag effect throughout the economy. The delay matters because it changes how people experience inflation. During the initial increase, consumers feel the shock immediately at the pump. During the later phase, they continue feeling pressure through groceries, deliveries, retail purchases, and routine spending long after the sharpest price movements slow down. The result is an economy where prices stop rising rapidly but still feel persistently high. Businesses also adapt during this phase. When transportation and operational costs rise, companies adjust prices to protect margins and maintain stability. Those adjustments are not automatically reversed once conditions stop worsening. Businesses continue operating within the higher cost environment that has already formed. This becomes especially important when supply constraints remain unresolved. Refinery utilization staying near 90 to 95% means the system still lacks significant flexibility. Production remains near practical limits, limiting the ability to rapidly expand supply and place downward pressure on fuel prices. Even after the most visible disruptions pass, the underlying system remains tight. As long as supply remains constrained relative to demand, elevated pricing tends to persist. Demand itself also contributes to this stability. The movement of goods does not slow dramatically because fuel becomes more expensive. Trucks still transport food, deliveries, and retail inventory. Consumers may adjust spending in some areas, but the logistics system continues operating because the economy still depends on constant movement of goods. This creates a situation where the earlier cost increases remain embedded throughout the system rather than disappearing once headlines fade. Over time, households begin responding differently to that reality. At first, higher prices feel temporary and disruptive. Later, they become part of everyday budgeting decisions. People stop reacting to each individual increase and begin adjusting to the broader environment instead. That adjustment can appear in small ways. Driving patterns become more intentional. Optional spending receives more scrutiny. Daily routines become slightly more structured around managing costs. None of these changes individually appear dramatic, but together they reflect something important. Elevated costs are no longer being treated as temporary. That is the moment when expensive becomes normalized. The normalization process is subtle because it develops gradually. There is no single point where consumers decide that higher costs are permanent. Instead, the adjustment happens through repetition. Week after week of elevated fuel prices, month after month of higher grocery bills, routine expenses remaining above earlier expectations long enough that people stop expecting immediate relief. This changes the emotional experience of the economy. The earlier stage produced frustration because prices were moving rapidly. The later stage produces fatigue because elevated costs continue without meaningful reversal. Consumers are no longer reacting to sudden increases, they are adapting to sustained pressure. That distinction explains why economic pressure can continue even when inflation appears less dramatic in headlines. A slowing rate of increase does not necessarily mean conditions feel affordable again. It only means prices are rising more slowly. If the price level itself remains elevated, households continue experiencing the effects through everyday spending. This is one of the most important transitions in the broader economic story of 2026. The system moved from a phase defined by shocks to a phase defined by persistence. Fuel prices rose quickly because supply tightened rapidly. But what followed was not a return to earlier conditions. Instead, elevated costs spread outward through transportation, goods, and household budgets, eventually becoming part of routine financial life. For consumers, that creates a specific kind of economic pressure. It is less visible than a sudden spike but often more lasting. The stress no longer comes from watching prices jump unexpectedly. It comes from recognizing that routine expenses remain consistently higher than before. And once households begin adjusting behavior around those elevated costs, the economy enters a different stage entirely. By the time elevated costs become routine, the response from households begins changing as well. The earlier phase was dominated by reaction. Prices moved quickly, and consumers focused on the immediate impact of rising fuel and transportation costs. But once those prices remained elevated for an extended period, the response became less visible and more gradual. This is where adaptation begins. The adjustment is often subtle enough that it does not immediately appear dramatic, even to the people making the changes themselves. There is no single moment where routines suddenly stop or lifestyles abruptly change. Instead, small decisions begin accumulating over time as households respond to the reality of persistently higher costs. Driving is one of the clearest examples because fuel remains a recurring expense tied directly to everyday activity. When gasoline prices remain around $4.18 per gallon and diesel continues operating near $5.65, households begin paying closer attention to movement that once felt automatic. Trips that previously required little thought start becoming more intentional. Errands are combined together. Optional drives become easier to postpone. Daily movement becomes more structured around efficiency. These changes are not signs of panic. They are signs of adjustment. The distinction matters because the economy often changes through gradual behavioral shifts long before those shifts become obvious in larger economic indicators. Most households do not suddenly stop participating in normal life because prices rise. Instead, they slowly reduce flexibility around spending and movement in ways that feel manageable in the moment. That process develops quietly. A single cancelled trip means very little by itself. Combining several errands into one drive does not appear economically significant on its own, but repeated across millions of households over long periods of time. These adjustments begin reflecting broader pressure inside the economy. The reason these changes emerge is straightforward. Elevated fuel costs affect more than the direct purchase of gasoline. Transportation costs remain embedded across daily spending because diesel continues influencing the movement of goods throughout the country. Groceries, deliveries, retail products, and household items continue reflecting transportation expenses that rose during the earlier fuel increase. As a result, households are not responding only to one expense. They are responding to multiple categories of spending remaining elevated at the same time. That broader pressure changes how budgets are managed. Earlier in the year, many consumers likely viewed higher fuel prices as temporary disruptions, but once elevated costs remain for months, the response shifts from short-term reaction to long-term adjustment. Households begin adapting routines around the expectation that prices may remain higher for longer than originally expected. This adaptation often appears through prioritization. Driving becomes more connected to necessity than convenience. Discretionary movement receives more consideration. Spending decisions become slightly more deliberate because elevated costs reduce the margin of flexibility inside household budgets. Importantly, this does not mean most people stop driving or dramatically alter their lives. The process is more restrained than that. The adaptation is gradual and uneven, developing differently across households depending on income, commuting needs, and financial pressure. But the broader direction remains consistent. Elevated costs encourage more careful decision-making. That carefulness becomes part of normal behavior over time. One of the most important aspects of this stage is that the pressure becomes less visible precisely because people adapt to it. During the initial spike, the disruption feels obvious because routines are interrupted suddenly. Later, households absorb the pressure into daily planning. The adjustment itself reduces the appearance of instability even while costs remain elevated. This creates a different economic atmosphere. The economy no longer feels defined by shock. Instead, it feels defined by caution. Consumers continue working, shopping, commuting, and spending, but often with slightly tighter calculations behind routine decisions. Those calculations may involve fuel costs directly, but they are also connected to groceries, deliveries, transportation expenses, and the broader feeling that routine life requires more financial management than before. Data from earlier research supports this broader pressure. Approximately 55% of Americans reported being financially affected by fuel costs, with around 21% describing the impact as severe. Those numbers suggest that elevated fuel prices are not isolated inconveniences. They are influencing household finances broadly enough to shape behavior over time. The adaptation process also reflects how persistent costs change expectations. At first, consumers wait for relief. They expect prices to normalize after disruptions ease. But when elevated costs continue month after month, households begin reorganizing around those conditions instead of waiting for them to disappear. That shift is significant because it represents movement from temporary response to structural adjustment. The earlier phase of rising prices created visible frustration. The later phase creates behavioral discipline. Consumers become more selective about movement, spending, and flexibility because elevated costs have become part of the environment they must operate within. This stage often develops with very little public attention because it lacks the dramatic visibility of rapid price spikes. There are fewer headlines once prices stop accelerating upward, yet the effects continue shaping decisions quietly beneath the surface of everyday life. That quietness is part of what makes the adaptation economically meaningful. Major economic shifts do not always arrive through dramatic collapses or obvious turning points. Sometimes they emerge through millions of routine adjustments made gradually over time. Small reductions in discretionary driving, more structured planning around errands, more attention paid to transportation and household expenses, slightly less spontaneity in everyday routines. Individually, none of these changes appear large. Collectively, they reveal how households respond when elevated costs stop feeling temporary. This is the stage where the economy moves beyond the initial shock and into normalization. Higher prices remain present long enough that consumers begin adapting behavior around them rather than expecting immediate reversal. And once that adaptation becomes routine, the pressure no longer feels temporary at all. The economic importance of these behavioral changes is not found in any single decision. It emerges from accumulation. One household combining errands does not change the economy. One person postponing unnecessary driving does not alter national demand. But when elevated costs remain in place long enough for millions of households to gradually adjust behavior in similar ways, those small changes begin reflecting broader economic conditions. This is why the quiet adaptation matters. The earlier phase of rising fuel prices was visible because the numbers changed rapidly. Consumers could see gasoline climbing toward $4.18 per gallon and diesel moving near $5.65. The pressure was measurable week by week, but once prices stabilized at elevated levels, the economy entered a more subtle stage. The focus shifted away from dramatic movement and toward how households responded to sustained costs over time. Consumer behavior becomes important in this stage because household spending and movement are closely tied to confidence and financial flexibility. When costs remain elevated across multiple categories, fuel, groceries, deliveries, transportation, households begin managing risk more carefully. The response is rarely dramatic. Instead, consumers slowly become more selective about spending that once felt routine. Optional trips receive more consideration. Daily planning becomes more structured. Purchases that once felt minor begin competing against other rising expenses. These are not signs of immediate economic collapse. They are signs of persistent financial pressure influencing behavior. The distinction matters because economies often weaken gradually before large indicators visibly change. The pressure appears first in routine adjustments rather than sudden disruptions. Households begin protecting flexibility before larger systems fully reflect the strain. Fuel costs are especially important in this process because they connect directly to both transportation and broader living expenses. Elevated diesel prices continue influencing freight costs because approximately 75% of goods move by truck. Transportation remains more expensive than before the earlier spike, and those costs continue spreading through supply chains. As a result, the cost of routine life remains elevated even after the pace of inflation slows. This creates a situation where consumers experience continued pressure without the same level of visible economic drama that existed during the initial fuel surge. Prices are no longer accelerating rapidly, but households still feel constrained because the overall cost structure remains higher than before. That environment changes how people think about spending. The shift often appears in discretionary activity first. Consumers continue paying for necessities, but flexibility around optional spending begins narrowing. Driving becomes more intentional because fuel costs remain elevated relative to earlier expectations. Spending decisions become more deliberate because higher transportation and household costs reduce available margin inside monthly budgets. These changes may appear small individually, but they become economically meaningful when repeated consistently across millions of households. One reason this stage is difficult to recognize immediately is that adaptation itself reduces visible instability. During the earlier phase, consumers reacted openly because prices were moving quickly. In the later phase, people reorganize around higher costs instead. The economy appears calmer on the surface precisely because households are adjusting behavior to absorb the pressure. But absorbing pressure does not mean the pressure disappeared. The system still reflects elevated fuel costs, constrained supply flexibility, and transportation expenses that remain above earlier levels. Refinery utilization near 90 to 95% continues limiting the system's ability to rapidly expand supply. Diesel remains elevated enough to maintain higher freight costs across logistics networks. Those conditions continue shaping household expenses even without another major spike. This is one reason why slowing inflation often feels different from relief. A slower rate of increase only means prices are not climbing as rapidly as before. It does not mean prices return to earlier levels. If gasoline remains around $4.18 and diesel remains near $5.65, households continue operating within a higher cost environment even if prices stabilize temporarily. For consumers, this creates a form of economic fatigue rather than immediate panic. The pressure becomes repetitive instead of dramatic. Each expense by itself may appear manageable, but repeated across fuel, groceries, transportation, and daily spending, the cumulative effect changes how households allocate resources. Over time, that adjustment becomes part of ordinary economic behavior. This stage also changes how economic conditions are perceived socially. Large economic disruptions are easy to identify because they generate obvious headlines and immediate reactions. Quiet adaptation generates fewer visible signals. People continue driving, working, shopping, and commuting. Daily life continues functioning, yet underneath that normal activity, routines are gradually becoming more constrained by elevated costs. That is what makes this stage economically significant. The economy is no longer reacting to temporary volatility. It is adapting to sustained pressure. This adaptation reflects something deeper than short-term frustration over fuel prices. It reflects a broader recognition that elevated costs may remain part of everyday life for longer than expected. Once households begin organizing behavior around that assumption, the economy enters a different phase entirely. The earlier stage was about instability. The current stage is about normalization. Consumers no longer respond primarily to headlines about fuel prices. They respond to the accumulated reality of higher monthly costs. That reality influences movement, spending, flexibility, and expectations around daily life. And because these adjustments happen gradually, they often reveal economic pressure more clearly than dramatic events do. Major economic changes do not always announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they appear through millions of ordinary decisions becoming slightly more cautious at the same time. The difference between shock and adaptation is not only economic, it is behavioral. The earlier phase of rising prices was defined by speed and visibility. The later phase is defined by persistence and adjustment. Understanding the difference between those two stages explains why economic pressure can continue even after the most dramatic increases begin to slow. During the initial phase of 2026, the pressure felt immediate. Fuel prices moved rapidly within a short period of time. Gasoline increased roughly 40%, while diesel climbed nearly 50% from earlier levels near the mid-$3 range. Refinery disruptions removed more than 800,000 barrels per day from supply. Inventories declined sharply, and refinery utilization remained near 90 to 95% capacity. The system tightened quickly, and consumers experienced the result almost immediately through rising fuel costs. That stage produced a very specific kind of reaction. Consumers focused on the shock itself because the increases were visible week by week. The economy felt unstable because prices were changing rapidly enough to interrupt expectations in real time. Fuel costs became headlines. Consumers noticed abrupt differences at the pump. Businesses adjusted to rapidly changing transportation expenses. The entire environment felt temporary but intense. Shock creates urgency because movement is fast. Adaptation develops differently. Once prices stop accelerating rapidly, the economy enters a quieter phase. The dramatic headlines begin fading even though the underlying cost structure remains elevated. Gasoline around $4.18 per gallon and diesel near $5.65 continue influencing household spending, transportation costs, and goods moving through supply chains. But because prices are no longer changing as quickly, the emotional experience of the economy begins shifting. Instead of reacting to movement, households begin adjusting to permanence. That transition is gradual enough that it often goes unnoticed at first. Consumers continue driving, commuting, shopping, and managing daily routines. The economy appears more stable because the visible volatility has slowed. Yet underneath that appearance of stability, households are reorganizing around the reality that costs remain higher than before. This is where adaptation replaces shock. The earlier phase demanded reaction. The later phase demands management. During shock, consumers focus on sudden increases because they feel temporary and disruptive. During adaptation, consumers begin assuming elevated costs may remain part of ordinary life for longer than expected. The response changes accordingly. Behavior becomes more deliberate. Flexibility becomes more limited. Spending decisions become slightly more calculated because households are adjusting to sustained pressure rather than waiting for rapid normalization. This creates a different kind of economic environment. Shock is visible because it interrupts routines suddenly. Adaptation is quieter because routines continue functioning while slowly changing underneath. People still drive to work. They still shop for necessities. They still move through daily life. But the margin around those routines becomes narrower over time. Driving patterns reflect this clearly. During the initial spike, higher gasoline prices create immediate frustration. Consumers react emotionally because costs changed quickly. But months later, the reaction becomes more restrained. Instead of focusing on the increase itself, households begin making practical adjustments around the new cost level. Trips become more intentional. Errands are combined together. Optional movement receives more scrutiny. These are not dramatic changes individually. That is precisely what makes adaptation harder to recognize. The economy often changes most significantly when pressure becomes normalized enough that people stop reacting emotionally and start adjusting behavior structurally. Once elevated costs become part of routine planning, households begin operating differently even without another visible disruption. That process can continue for long periods because adaptation reduces the appearance of instability. Consumers absorb pressure gradually through behavior changes instead of experiencing constant visible shock. The economy feels calmer on the surface while still operating under elevated costs underneath. This distinction also changes how economic stress spreads. Shock concentrates attention because movement is immediate. Adaptation distributes pressure slowly across routines, expectations, and household planning. Consumers may no longer talk constantly about fuel prices, but they continue making decisions shaped by those prices every week. The persistence of diesel costs reinforces this process. Diesel remains tied directly to freight movement, and approximately 75% of goods continue moving through trucking networks affected by elevated fuel expenses. Transportation costs remain higher than before the earlier increase, which means the price structure throughout retail and consumer goods continues reflecting those earlier pressures. As long as those conditions remain in place, adaptation continues as well. One of the most important differences between shock and adaptation is psychological expectation. During shock, consumers expect relief once disruptions ease. During adaptation, households begin adjusting to the possibility that elevated costs may not disappear quickly. Expectations shift from temporary disruption toward long-term management. That shift affects how people approach ordinary life. Spending becomes more intentional. Daily flexibility becomes slightly more constrained. Budgeting receives more attention because higher costs remain present across multiple categories at the same time. The pressure no longer feels exceptional. It begins feeling routine. This is where the economy changes most quietly. Large disruptions attract immediate attention because they are easy to identify. Quiet adaptation develops without the same visibility because people continue functioning normally while slowly reorganizing behavior around sustained costs. But economically, that stage may matter even more. An economy built around adaptation reflects pressure that has lasted long enough to alter habits rather than simply provoke reactions. The earlier phase was driven by instability inside the fuel system. The later phase is defined by how households respond once elevated costs become embedded in daily life. That is the transition taking place now. The system is no longer dominated by rapid acceleration in prices. It is defined by the persistence of higher costs and the behavioral adjustments that follow them. Consumers are no longer reacting primarily to sudden increases. They are adapting to the possibility that expensive has become normal. And once adaptation replaces shock, the economic story becomes less about headlines and more about routine life itself. The current reality is defined less by sudden disruption and more by persistence. The sharpest phase of fuel increases has already passed, but the broader system continues operating under the conditions those increases created. Gasoline remains elevated near $4.18 per gallon. Diesel remains near $5.65. Transportation costs continue reflecting those levels, and supply flexibility remains limited by refinery utilization operating near 90 to 95% capacity. The economy has stabilized in some ways, but it has stabilized at a higher cost level than before. That distinction explains why many households continue feeling pressure even without another dramatic spike in prices. The earlier increase did not disappear once headlines slowed down. It became embedded throughout transportation, distribution, and household spending. Costs that rose during the initial shock continue influencing the price of routine life months later. This is the environment consumers are now operating within. Fuel remains expensive relative to earlier expectations. Diesel continues affecting freight movement across a system where approximately 75% of goods are transported by truck. Goods that move through those supply chains continue reflecting elevated transportation expenses. The pressure no longer feels temporary because it has remained in place long enough to become part of ordinary budgeting. That persistence shapes behavior quietly. Consumers continue adapting in small but meaningful ways. Driving becomes more intentional. Flexibility around spending becomes narrower. Daily routines continue functioning, but often with more calculation behind them than before. These adjustments do not appear dramatic individually, yet they reflect the broader reality of an economy where elevated costs remain unresolved. One of the defining features of the current stage is that the pressure has become normalized. Earlier in the year, rapid fuel increases created visible instability and immediate reactions. Now the economy feels calmer on the surface because consumers have adjusted behavior around the expectation that higher costs may continue. Adaptation reduces visible volatility, but it does not eliminate the underlying pressure. This creates a quieter form of economic strain. The system no longer depends on rapidly rising prices to affect households. Elevated costs alone are enough to continue shaping decisions. Consumers may no longer respond emotionally to every movement in fuel prices, but they continue organizing spending around the reality that routine expenses remain higher than before. That shift changes the nature of the economic story. The earlier phase was about shock. The current phase is about endurance. Households are no longer reacting primarily to sudden increases. They are managing a cost structure that remains elevated across multiple categories of daily life. The challenge is no longer understanding why prices rose quickly. It is understanding what happens when those prices remain high long enough to alter behavior permanently. This is why the adaptation itself matters. Economic pressure often becomes most visible not through dramatic events, but through gradual changes in routine behavior repeated over time. More careful driving, more deliberate spending, slightly reduced flexibility, small adjustments that individually seem ordinary but collectively reveal how sustained costs reshape everyday life. The broader system reflects that same persistence. Supply conditions remain relatively tight. Transportation costs remain elevated. Businesses continue operating within the higher cost environment established during the earlier fuel increase, without major changes in supply flexibility or sustained reductions in fuel costs. The structure supporting elevated prices remains largely intact. As a result, the economy continues operating in a state where prices are no longer accelerating sharply, but relief also remains limited. For households, that creates a very different emotional experience than the initial spike. The earlier phase produced immediate frustration because the increases felt sudden and unstable. The current phase produces caution because higher costs feel continuous. Consumers adapt not because conditions improved, but because elevated expenses remained long enough that adjustment became necessary. That is the current reality. The economy is no longer defined primarily by the shock itself. It is defined by how households continue responding after the shock has already moved through the system. The visible acceleration in prices may have slowed, but the financial pressure created by those earlier increases continues shaping daily behavior across the country. And in many ways, that quieter stage may reveal more about the economy than the original surge ever did.